Advantages of New Orleans. It was predicted by Jefferson when he purchased Louisiana that New Orleans, its port and capital, would become not only the greatest commercial city in America, but in the world, and he gave very good reasons for the prediction. He pointed out, for instance, that it was the natural port of the Mississippi Valley, which he foresaw was to become the seat of a great and populous empire, and that all the varied product of that valley would find their way to New Orleans by 1,000 streams, while to the south lay Mexico, Cuba, and the tropics. New Orleans, therefore, lay at the gateway of the continent, and could not be better placed to handle the immense trade that must spring up between the Mississippi Valley and the tropics on the one hand, and Europe on the other. Such produce as Latin America shipped to the interior could but be sent through New Orleans and vice versa, and the people of the interior would, he predicted, find in the Crescent City the port they needed for the exchange of their products with Europe. Through that city, they would find the teeming millions of the Old World, receiving in return such manufactured goods as Europe could turn out more profitably than America. La Salle had a slight conception of the future of New Orleans when he hoisted the French flag over the site of the city in 1684, and Bienville when he located his capital there and pointed out to the French government the advantages which a location near the mouth of the Mississippi offered. He was more of a prophet than Jefferson, because at that time the upper valley was entirely unsettled, and it required a very vivid imagination to foresee that within 2 centuries a population of 30-odd millions would spring up in a country where only a few wild Indians roamed. In Jefferson's time, immigration was pouring into the upper Ohio Valley, and the produce of that section was already beginning to reach New Orleans by flatboat and barge. With wonderful prescience, the author of the Declaration of Independence looked a century ahead and saw what New Orleans ought to become. If this prediction has not been fully realized as yet, it is due to the possible accidents which Mr. Jefferson allowed for. He could not foresee the fact that the invention of the locomotive would cause a temporary interruption in the commerce and progress of New Orleans, nor could he imagine the Civil War, which undid the work of a century. But what he said is equally true today as it was nearly 100 years ago when he said it. The commercial advantages of New Orleans are just as great now as then. The city has lost nothing in its opportunities, it has simply not fully utilized them because accidents have temporarily prevented it from doing so. From 1803 to 1840, Jefferson's prediction was in a fair way of being realized. Then, for 40 years, there was a tendency towards an eclipse. But the eclipse is passing off now, and the world is beginning to appreciate the fact that New Orleans is as well situated for commerce today as it was in 1803. Indeed, an advantage which Jefferson did not foresee is coming to light. New Orleans is quite as well situated for manufactures as for commerce. If it utilizes all its advantages, it will become not only a great commercial city, the mart of the continent, as the political economists of half a century predicted for it, but one of the world's great manufacturing centers. New Orleans is today, and has been for half a century, the second port in the Union, its commerce, its imports and exports being exceeded only by those of New York. As already remarked, it promised at one time to be the great port of America, and in the decade just preceding the Civil War, more than half the time it exceeded Manhattan in the value of its exports of American products. The special efforts of New Orleans for the last quarter of a century have been to recover the ground lost during the Civil War and the demoralized condition of affairs that immediately followed it. And much has been accomplished in that time towards developing the commercial advantages the city enjoys and in fully utilizing them. Perhaps no port in the country has done more in the last half-dozen years in the way of improving its transportation and terminal facilities than New Orleans. New Orleans is situated 110 miles from the mouth of the Mississippi River. Thus, while its ships are offered the most perfect protection from storm and ocean disaster, it is a seaport in every sense of the word, with every facility for handling ocean commerce and with water sufficient to float in its harbor the navies of the world. This harbor is reached by a permanent channel 30 feet deep, and as the tide is never more than 18 inches, there is ample water for the passage of the largest vessel, and it is not necessary, as at so many other ports, to wait for a high tide to float a vessel in. Actual soundings show a depth of 200 feet in the river in front of New Orleans, and it is nowhere less than 100 feet there. There is water sufficient alongshore and close by the wharves to allow the largest vessel to land directly at them. Lighterage, which prevails at Buenos Aires, and many of the other great ports of the world is altogether unnecessary at the Crescent City. The river frontage embraced in the port of New Orleans is about 12 miles on each side of the Mississippi, making about 24 miles which can be utilized for the purposes of commerce, but in addition to this frontage, there was considerable wharfage at Southport above and Port Chalmette below, on the east bank of the river, and at Oswego on the west bank, none of which are within the corporate limits of New Orleans. Indeed, were there any need for it, the entire riverbank from New Orleans to the Gulf, 100 miles, could be used for loading and unloading vessels. The average width of the river in all this distance is 2,200 feet, with plenty of water on either bank to float the largest ships in the world, so that there is no difficulty and delay in vessels constantly passing up and down, as in the case of the narrow channel of the Thames at London. In the front of the populous portion of the city on the left or east bank, extending from Louisiana Avenue to Piety Street, a distance of 6 miles, are wharves that have been recently constructed and are available for the handling of 3 times the commerce that New Orleans now possesses. The wharves extend from 100 to 200 feet into the river and are built of heavy timbers capable of sustaining any weight. From these wharves or landings, the bulk of the business of the port is handled. The several railroad companies with termini at New Orleans have switch tracks extending along the riverfront, thus enabling men to handle their cars at the shipside for both inward and outward cargoes. At Southport, half a mile above the city limits, are extensive wharves belonging to the Illinois Central and Yazoo and Mississippi Valley Railroads, at which large quantities of cotton, corn, wheat, lumber, cottonseed oil, and cake, and other products are loaded into the steamers which moor directly at the landings. At the foot of General Taylor Street, the Illinois Central has established the Stuyvesant Works, the most perfectly equipped in the country. There are 2 grain elevators, the largest in the South, and ample wharves and warehouses. At Port Chalmette, just below New Orleans, the New Orleans and Western Railroad, which is practically a beltline for the city, has invested some $2,500,000 in providing the most complete terminal facilities, wharves, warehouses, cotton presses, elevators, etc. Most of the warehouses, elevators, and factories of the city are situated along the riverfront. At Algiers are several dry docks, and the United States proposes to construct an immense dry dock there for the repairs of its men of war, and has taken the initial steps in that direction by the purchase of the necessary land. It may be stated in this connection that a commission appointed by the United States government for the purpose of choosing a site for the location of a dry dock made a thorough investigation of all the southern ports and decided that New Orleans offered far greater advantages than any other port on the Gulf or South Atlantic, having deeper, safer, and better water, better protection from the enemy, and being superior in many other ways to other candidates for the government dock. While New Orleans does not control the commerce of the Mississippi Valley as completely as it did a century or even a half-century ago, it has made great commercial progress, has developed new lines of commerce, and seems disposed at last to fully utilize its advantages. It has built up, for instance, an immense grain trade and is competing for the position of the first grain port of the Union, having proved that it can handle the grain of all the country west of the Mississippi on cheaper and better terms than any other port south or east. This grain comes both by rail and by river, and 6 large elevators in the city are required to handle it. New Orleans has secured, as was to be expected, a monopoly of the tropical fruit trade of Central and South America, and indeed all the commerce of that country. On the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua and Honduras, not only is the trade monopolized by New Orleans, but nearly all the capital employed there is supplied by this city, and in fact most of the real estate is owned by it. This means that New Orleans will be the chief beneficiary by the completion of the Nicaraguan Canal, as it is the nearest American port to the mouth of that canal. Several tributes have lately been paid to the advantages New Orleans offers as a purchasing and shipping point. Thus, the Spanish government, during the war with Cuba, after establishing purchasing agencies in several ports, finally concentrated them all in New Orleans, and purchased and exported all of their supplies from that city, declaring that they could do so to greater advantage than from any other port in America. What was true of Spain in the Cuban War was equally true of Great Britain in the Boer War. The British War Office having established a commission in New Orleans for the purchase of mules, horses, and such supplies as were needed, while the Boers made New Orleans the port of shipment of such grain and western produce as they bought in America, the goods being shipped because of the blockade against Transvaal via Holland. Finally, the Japanese cotton mill owners sent a number of purchasers over to examine the advantages of American ports for the purchase and shipment of cotton to Japan, which commission, after a thorough examination of the subject, reported in favor of New Orleans, and vessels now sail from the Crescent City direct to Kobe and other Japanese ports, a distance of 14,000 miles by the Suez Canal, one of the longest voyages taken by vessels anywhere. New Orleans has now direct steamship navigation with more than 80 of the leading ports in the world. Indeed, there is no port of any commercial standing with which it has not direct steamship connection. Most of these steamers engaged in trade belong to regular lines and run on scheduled time, whereas of old, the trade of the city was largely in the hands of tramp vessels. Steps are on foot to improve the facilities of New Orleans for handling commerce and to reduce the cost. It is proposed, for instance, to make it a free port, at which vessels shall pay no charge of any kind. This will be possible in 1902, when the wharves of the city, which are now in the hands of a company, will become the property of the city again. New Orleans offers the following advantages for commerce. 1. The largest system of great railroad lines terminating there, giving it access to every part of the country. These railroads, formerly inimical to New Orleans or lukewarm as to its trade, have come to see that their prosperity is dependent on the prosperity of the city, are laboring earnestly to hold up its trade, and have invested their capital in wharves, docks, and other improvements advantageous to the commerce of the city, thereby showing their confidence in its future. 2. The Mississippi River, affording, with its tributaries, 17,650 miles of navigable waterway, all of them open 3/4 of the year, and most of them open the entire 12 months. These waterways extend into 29 states and territories, and the population living along their banks now exceeding 32 millions. The immense valley drained by these streams, and which through them has constant and direct connection by water with New Orleans, enjoys every clime and produces every article, agricultural, mineral, or manufactured, that mankind needs. In the north are the grain fields of Dakota and Minnesota, in the west the mineral region of Colorado, in the east the coal and iron of Pennsylvania and Ohio, and the manufacturing cities of that section, while the south offers the lumber of Arkansas, the cotton of Mississippi and Texas, and the sugar and rice of Louisiana. The Mississippi and its network of tributary streams offers free of all charge or costs 1/8 as much mileage as the railroads of the United States, upon whose construction billions of dollars have been expended. It acts as a regulator of freight and prevents the railroads from advancing their rates as they can do to New York and the Atlantic seaboard. And it offers the cheapest mode of transportation for bulky articles such as coal and timber, with the consequences that New Orleans receives its supply of fuel at less cost than any American seaport, while its sawmills and furniture and other factories receive their supplies of timber at a minimum cost. The river allows the barges to deliver their coal direct to steamships in the harbor, and offers extraordinary facilities for delivering materials to the mills and in loading products upon ships for export. 3. A splendid harbor extending some 12 miles on both sides of the Mississippi, allowing steamships, steamboats, and barges to come together, putting the shipping in immediate communication with the railroads and offering the finest opportunities for the transshipment of freight. The harbor is from 40 to 50 feet deep immediately off the wharves, and 200 feet deep in the center of the river. This harbor is furnished with a fine system of wharves newly constructed along a large part of the frontage, supplemented by the dock and warehouses of the Yazoo and Mississippi Valley Railroad above the city at Southport. The extensive wharves, presses, and elevators of the New Orleans and Western Railroad just below the city of Port Chalmette, the wharves, elevators, etc. of the Texas and Pacific Railroad at Westwego, just opposite the terminal facilities of the Southern Pacific Railroad at Algiers, also opposite the city proper, and the complete docks of the Illinois Central Railroad in the very center of the riverfront and known as the Stuyvesant Docks. 4. Deep water to the Gulf of Mexico, open at all times of the year and free from all danger of ice and storms, and promising still greater improvement when Southwest Pass shall have been jettied, improved, and deepened, and an alternative route thus assured to the shipping, permitting vessels of 35 feet draft to reach New Orleans without a delay or hindrance. 5. ample warehouse facilities, grain elevators, and cotton presses sufficient to handle all the warehouse and shipping business of the city, these establishments being located convenient to the trade and rates of handling being fair and reasonable. 6. Railroad switches running from the trunk lines and beltline railroads into the factories both in the front and rear of the city, supplying them with such materials as they may need and taking their output to market at a minimum expense in loading, unloading, hauling, and handling. 7. There is practically a belt road in the New Orleans and Western Railroad, which runs in the immediate rear of the city, extending from Avondale above, where it is proposed to construct a bridge across the Mississippi River, to Port Chalmette below, thus uniting the various railroads entering the city. The Illinois Central Railroad also enjoys belting privileges on St. Joseph Street and Louisiana Avenue, and the City Council has undertaken to arrange for the continuation of a belt line along the entire riverfront, which will be owned by the city and controlled and operated in the interest of all the railroads centering there. 8. Satisfactory labor conditions. The cost of handling goods has been very materially reduced of late by the utilization of labor-saving machinery and devices instead of depending on rough manual labor as formerly. New Orleans has been but little interfered with by strikes, labor disturbances, and similar economic obstacles as compared with other ports, American and European. 9. The nearness of New Orleans to the chief interior centers of production, as well as to the Latin American countries to the south, making it the port through which the products of the South and West can be marketed in the shortest possible time. This question of time and expedition having become of late the most important element in commerce. A comparison of the differences in distance between New Orleans and its chief rival New York shows how great is the advantage in point of time the former possesses.